let's get going. All right, here's our table of contents for today. We're discussing first civil rights, the Vietnam War, Stonewall Inn, the JFK assassination, and ultimately the death of the 1960s, as the century came to, or as that period came to a close. So, the first thing I want to talk about in regards to civil rights is the Woolworth lunch counter protests. I don't know, some of these topics you might have heard about when you took American history, maybe in high school. Maybe you didn't hear about some of these topics, but I think that those bulleted items kind of come together and give a good overview of the 1960s as a decade. So, on February 1st, we're starting right at the beginning of it. 1960, four college students took a stand against segregation in Greensboro, North Carolina, by refusing to leave a Woolworth's lunch counter without being served. And over the next several days, hundreds of people joined their cause in what became known as the Greensboro sit-ins. So after some were arrested and charged with trespassing, protesters launched a boycott of all segregated lunch counters until the owners caved, and the original four students were finally served at the Woolworth's lunch counter where they had first stood their ground. Now, their efforts spearheaded peaceful sit-ins and demonstrations in dozens of cities and helped launch the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee to encourage all students to get involved in the civil rights movement. It also caught the eye of young college graduate Stokely Carmichael, who joined the SNCC during the Freedom Summer of 1964 to register Black voters in Mississippi. In 1966, Carmichael became the chair of the SNCC, giving his famous speech in which he originated the phrase Black Power. All right, the next topic that we're going to again do a 30,000 foot overview on is going to be the Vietnam War. So, again, this is something that you most definitely learned about, I'm sure, in American history if you're of a certain age. But again, I went to high school in the 90s, and I felt like a lot of these topics were just kind of, you know, touched upon. Like, we didn't really get deep into it, and we didn't get, we definitely didn't talk a lot about like the civil unrest that was happening at this time. And although this is going to be again, just a couple of paragraphs on the Vietnam War, I hope it will pique your interest to look into this more. So the Vietnam War was a long, costly, and divisive conflict that pitted the communist government of North Vietnam against South Vietnam and its principal ally, the United States. The conflict was intensified by the ongoing Cold War between the US and the Soviet Union. More than 3 million people, including 58,000 Americans, were killed in the Vietnam War. And more than half of the dead were Vietnamese civilians. So, again, civilians, not soldiers on each side. Opposition to the war in the United States was it bitterly divided the country. Even after President Richard Nixon ordered the withdrawal of U.S. forces in 1973. Communist forces ended up ending the war by seizing control of South Vietnam in 1975, and the country was unified as the Socialist Republic of Vietnam the following year. By November, though, of 1967, the number of American troops in Vietnam was approaching 500,000, a half million troops. And U.S. casualties by that point had reached 15,058 killed and 109,527 wounded. As the war stretched on, some soldiers came to mistrust the government's reason for even keeping them there, as well as Washington's repeated claims that, hey, we're winning the war, we're winning the war. They were on the ground, they knew what was happening. The later years of the war saw increased physical and psychological deterioration among American soldiers, both volunteers and draftees. And that included drug use, post traumatic stress disorder, which is kind of, common in our vernacular now, saying PTSD, but it wasn't back then. There were mutinies and attacks by soldiers against officers and non commissioned officers. Between July of 1966 and December of 1973, more than 503,000 US military personnel deserted. That's a staggering number. And a robust anti war movement among American forces spawned violent protests, killings, and mass incarceration of personnel staged in Vietnam as well as within the US. You know, as much as like troops knew what was going on, the American public did as well because they were bombarded by horrific images of the war on their televisions. Everybody, almost every American household had a TV during that time. And Americans on the home front, they turned against the war as well. In October of 1967, some 35,000 demonstrators staged a massive Vietnam War protest outside the Pentagon. Opponents of the war argued that civilians, not enemy combatants, were the primary victims and that the US was supporting a corrupt dictatorship in Saigon. So again, the tide turned. All right, next we're going to discuss something that I most definitely did not learn about in high school. This is the story of the Stonewall Inn, also known as the Stonewall Riots. So the Stonewall Riots, also called the Stonewall Uprising, that began in the early hours of June 28th, 1969, when New York City police raided the Stonewall Inn, a gay club located in Greenwich Village in New York City. This raid sparked, among patrons, a riot. And even the neighborhood residents got involved as police were roughly hauling employees and patrons out of the bar, leading to 6 days of protests and violent clashes with law enforcement outside the bar on Christopher Street, in neighboring streets, and in nearby Christopher Park. The Stonewall riots also served as a catalyst for the gay rights movement in the United States and around the world. You know, the 1960s and the preceding decades, they were not a welcoming time if you were lesbian, gay, bisexual, or transgender. And for purposes of, this mini lesson, I'm just going to use the LGBT acronym, just because that's kind of what was standard during that time. So, for instances, solicitation of same sex relations, that was illegal, like illegal against the law in New York City. So, because of those reasons, LGBT individuals, they flocked to gay bars and clubs because it was a place of refuge where they could express themselves openly and they could socialize without being worried. However, the New York State Liquor Authority, they penalized and shut down establishments that served alcohol, okay, to known or suspected LGBT individuals. So if you were gay and they knew you were gay, you were not allowed to be served at a bar. If they thought you were gay, you were not allowed to be served at a bar, and the entire bar could be shut down and lose its liquor license for serving you. The state of New York actually argued that the mere gathering of homosexuals was disorderly. So again, crazy, crazy times compared to where we are now, and we still have so much further to go. So thanks to activist efforts, those regulations were actually overturned in 1966, and LGBT patrons could now be served alcohol. But, because there's always a but, engaging in gay behavior in public, and that could be holding hands, kissing, or dancing with someone who is of the same sex, that was still illegal. So, police harassment of gay bars continued, and many bars, they still ended up operating without liquor licenses. And this is where an interesting group comes in. They were operating without a liquor license, in part because they were owned by the mafia. And this is all going to start to make sense in my next sentence that I'm about to say. So when police raided the Stonewall Inn on the morning of June 28th, it came as a surprise because the bar was not tipped off. Think about it. Mafia usually getting tipped off by somebody that there's going to be a raid. Well, this time it didn't happen. So armed with a warrant, police officers entered the club, they roughed up patrons, and they ended up finding bootlegged alcohol. They arrested 13 people, including employees and people violating the state's gender appropriate clothing statute. So, and this is horrific that this happened to people. Female officers were actually taking suspected cross dressing patrons into the bathroom to check their sex. Just complete violation of people's human rights. So, fed up with this constant police harassment and social discrimination, angry patrons and neighborhood residents hung around outside of the bar instead of dispersing, and they became increasingly agitated as the events unfolded, and people were aggressively being manhandled. At one point, an officer hit a lesbian over the head as he forced her into the paddy wagon, and she shouted at the onlookers, like, to do something. So that incited the crowd, and they began to throw pennies, bottles, even cobblestones. Like they're literally picking up the street and throwing it at the police. Within minutes, there was a full blown riot that involved hundreds of people. And the police, a few prisoners, so people like that they actually had in handcuffs, and a Village Voice writer who happened to be there, they all barricaded themselves inside of the bar, which the mob outside attempted to then set fire to after they breached the barricades repeatedly. So it was just full blown chaos. And um, the fire department, the riot squad, they were eventually able to douse the flames and rescue those inside and disperse the crowd. But the protests, sometimes involving thousands of people, it continued in the area for 5 more days, and it flared up at one point after the Village Voice published its accounts of the riots. All right. Next, we're going to move on to the JFK assassination, which I definitely learned about in high school. But again, it's this was one of those topics when I learned about the 1960s where I kind of had like a fascination with the JFK assassination and learning everything about it. And I think because there was, the conspiracy theory related to it, and just as somebody growing up in the 90s, like seeing everything that is in place to keep a president safe, now I was like, how did this happen? So if you're a fan of Stephen King, like a little bit of like we're going off, down a different road for a second. But if you are a fan of Stephen King, if you have not yet read 11/22/63, please do. I mean, I've been reading Stephen King since I think I was in middle school, which probably says a lot about me. And I have to say, as much as like I love his horror novels and I love his writing, I think 11/22/63 is seriously my favorite novel by him. And if you haven't read it, read it or listen to the audiobook even. It's great. I will say I was a little bit disappointed in the Hulu um, miniseries. Like I was so excited, and then they cast James Franco, and it was just a complete miscasting. But now we've gone over here. So let's just get back to the JFK assassination. So shortly after noon on November 22nd, 1963, President John F. Kennedy was assassinated as he rode in a motorcade through Dealey Plaza in downtown Dallas, Texas. This was like a big deal that he was coming to Texas to visit. And there were crowds of excited people that were lining the streets. They were waving to the Kennedys. You've probably seen the footage from that day. And the car turned down Main Street at Dealey Plaza at 12:30 p.m. And as it was passing by the Texas School Book Depository, gunfire rang out and it reverberated in the plaza. So, again, captured on video. So, bullets struck the president's neck and head, and he slumped over towards Mrs. Kennedy in the car. And also, the governor who was in that car, he was shot in the back. The car sped off to Parkland Memorial Hospital, just a few minutes away, but unfortunately, little could be done for the president, and a Catholic priest was summoned to administer the last rites. And at 1 p.m., John F. Kennedy was pronounced dead. I also remember seeing, again, probably in school, maybe outside of school, in documentaries, like the footage of Walter Cronkite letting the nation know live on air. And it's just chilling to kind of watch that. So Although he was seriously wounded, Governor Connolly would survive this assassination attempt. The president's body was brought to Love Field and placed on Air Force One. Before the plane took off, a very grim faced Lyndon B. Johnson stood in the tight, crowded compartment and took the oath of office. And again, there's photos of that, and you can see Mrs. Kennedy standing next to him. She's still in the same, like, blood splattered pink pea coat and dress with the pink pill hat. It's just such a just like a look of kind of utter shock on her face. Like, she's just very stoic standing there, but you can tell, like, if you've ever had to deal with like a trauma and a shock like that, like, you clearly have not processed what happened yet. And you can see that in the photo. Um, and that oath of office was administered by U.S. Court Judge Sarah Hughes. It was a very brief ceremony, definitely no pomp, no circumstance, and it took place at 2:38 p.m. Less than an hour before this, though, police had arrested Lee Harvey Oswald. He was a recently hired employee at the Texas Book Depository, and he was being held not only for the assassination of President John F. Kennedy, but also for the fatal shooting thereafter of Patrolman J.D. Tippit on a Dallas street. Now, on Sunday morning, November 24th, Oswald was scheduled to be transferred from police headquarters to the county jail. And again, live on television, viewers across America, they ended up watching live television coverage where suddenly a man aiming a pistol came right across the screen and fired at Oswald at point blank range. And in quite possibly the most ironic of all situations, um, Oswald died 2 hours later at the same hospital, at Parkland Hospital, the same hospital where JFK had passed away. And that assailant was later identified as Jack Ruby, and he was a local nightclub owner. So again, 11/22/63 by Stephen King. He actually does like a real. It's fictitious, but it's kind of like a historical fiction, and he does do a big deep dive into Oswald and Jack Perry, Jack Ruby, and like all of the different events taking place. And it's fascinating. It's a fascinating read. Please read it. All right. So, the death of the 1960s. For all of the bad things that seemed to happen in the 1960s, and I know we touched upon a lot of like kind of the negative things that happened during that decade, the 60s were still kind of optimistic, at least for America, right? Uh, You know, all of the bad, there was a lot of good that was like trying to take place, right? During that time period. But even with saying that, the optimistic 60s, they kind of went sour in 1968. That year, the brutal North Vietnamese Tet Offensive convinced many people, again on television sets, that the Vietnam War was going to be impossible to win, and also it saw the Democratic Party splitting at the end of March because Johnson went on television to announce that he was ending his reelection campaign. So then Republican Richard Nixon, who was the chief spokesman of you probably heard this, silent majority, he won the election that fall. 1968 also saw Martin Luther King Jr. and Bobby Kennedy, two of the most visibly leftist progressives in American politics. They were assassinated. Police used tear gas and billy clubs to break up protests at the 1968 Democratic National Convention in Chicago. There was furious anti-war protests that took place over at Columbia University in New York. There were even protests that took place in Paris and Berlin. And the urban riots that had erupted across the country every summer since the summer of 1964, they continued and intensified. But there were shreds, right? Little nuggets of like those hopeful 60s that were still kind of popping up here and there. In this, we can't mention the 1960s without mentioning this. So in the summer of 1969, more than 400,000 young people trucked it up to, upstate New York to the Woodstock Music Festival, which was, a harmonious 3 days that seemed to kind of represent the best of that peace and love generation, right? And by the end of the decade, however, community and consensus in the US, it kind of laid in tatters. And the era's legacy, I feel, is really mixed. It brought empowerment, but also polarization, resentment, but also liberation. And it's certainly become a permanent part of our political and our cultural lives. I mean, we're still talking about that decade, and we're still talking about it with a lot of fascination. So, if you look in the comments, you can head on over to the social studies mini lesson on the 1960s. And there is some practice work that you can complete. You can type up your response in the chat. The best thing about mini lessons, I want to get you thinking about a topic that maybe you haven't heard of before. And you're like, you know what? That's interesting, and I want to look into that further. So, our question for this mini lesson was, please choose one topic to investigate further. Do you want to investigate the Woolworths lunch counter, the Vietnam War, the Stonewall Inn, or the JFK assassination? Maybe you read 11/22/63 and you want to talk about it. Hey, maybe you want to talk a little bit about Woodstock. Let's get active in the chat. So, thank you to everybody who came in today for our kind of a lunchtime live, right? I've got some meetings the rest of the day, but I wanted to pop in with you guys before those took place and just have a little chat on the 1960s. All right. I hope to see you all soon. Have a great day.